Half a day, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. The Committee on Health, Tourism, Historic Preservation, Land, and Justice is called to order. Today's Thursday, November 7, 2019, and the time is about 2:10 p.m. Notices for this public hearing were disseminated via email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets on Tuesday, October 29, and again on Tuesday, November 5th, 2019. The notice was also published in the Guam Daily Post on Friday, October 31, and Tuesday, November 5, 2019. So there are 3 items on our agenda today, 3 bills, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues, Senator James Moylan and Senator Terlaje. Thank you for being here. And thank you to all of you who are here. I know we've got directors here, and I thank you for taking the time to weigh in on these measures. Appreciate that very much. So we're going to begin with Bill number 173-35. This is a bill that I introduced, and it is a bill that really was motivated by a story that kind of shocked our community about repeat sex offenders who were out on parole committing another crime. And so many of you participated with us in prior roundtables, and I want to thank you again, and I think we got some very good information at that point that we're hoping to build upon here today. And so because of the unique nature of criminal sexual conduct and the repeat offenses that we were finding in the news and that had plagued our parole system and our regular release system, pre-trial release system and post-trial release system, that we are trying to address criminal sexual conduct in particular by these bills today. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Senator Amanda Shelton. Thank you, Senator. So prior to 2017, well, at one of the roundtables that we had, we talked about the status of the sex offenders on release, the sex offender registry, risk assessments, sentencing, and many other related topics, the availability of treatment for these offenders. And so it was determined that prior to 2017, there were no rehabilitation or treatment programs available on Guam for repeat criminal sexual conduct offenders. The Department of Corrections reported that it recently instituted a sex offender treatment program based on cognitive behavior interventions, CBI, best practices. But only 15 people were able to be put in that program at a time. And we also found that psychological evaluations are often requested by the parole board to be included in the parole investigation reports used to make parole decisions. However, these evaluations are not always conducted or made available to the parole board before the parole hearings are held. The chairman of the parole board reported that in light of the case that we were discussing at that time, no hearings, they had put a hold on hearings until they made a new policy that from then on they would not conduct hearings in criminal sexual conduct offenses unless they had a completed psychological evaluation. Risk assessments are not catered to criminal sexual conduct repeat offenders, and this risk may not be adequately known by judges or the Department of Corrections or the parole board. We also found that pre-sentencing investigation reports and recommendations regarding parole made at the time of sentencing have not been available to the parole office or the parole board when making parole decisions, even though it's mandated by statute. So we seem to be facing the reality that criminal sexual conduct offenders will continue to be released at the expiration of sentence without treatment in many cases and without accurate risk assessment. So we're hoping to change that now with this bill and with many other measures, and of course with just the improvements within the agencies. And I know that you are all working very diligently on this, and I want to commend you for that. So Bill 173-35, COR, is an act to add a new Chapter 93 to Title 9 of the Guam Code Annotated relative to establishing a standardized risk assessment and system of treatment programs for criminal sexual conduct offenders, which shall be known as the Criminal Sexual Conduct Assessment and Rehabilitation Act. The intent is to curtail the risk of further harm from persons accused of or convicted of criminal sexual conduct through the implementation of standardized procedures for the assessment of those individuals for dangerousness and risk of recidivism, of reoffending. So this act will require the courts to assess the dangerousness and risk of recidivism before release on probation, pre-trial, pre-sentence, or parole. And the Superior Court of Guam, the Department of Corrections, the Parole Board, the Guam Police Department, and the Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center is going to comprise our assessment team and shall cooperate to develop and implement the following: a standardized procedure for assessment to include the use of physiological testing in conjunction with a thorough psychiatric eval, comprehensive sexual history, and clinical expertise or such other tests deemed appropriate. 2, a system of programs for treatment and rehabilitation of individuals accused or convicted, which can be utilized by offenders placed on probation, incarcerated with the Department of Corrections, placed on parole, or in the community corrections, or released. And the assessment team shall cooperate to develop a schedule of fees sufficient to cover the costs of these assessment, the testing, the treatment, to be paid by the persons, except in the case that they are indigent. Furthermore, persons convicted of criminal sexual conduct felonies who do not complete treatment and rehabilitation as recommended by a court, parole board, or Department of Corrections official based on these assessments shall not be eligible for early release. The act will also require the assessment team to develop programs for the periodic assessment of offenders under the jurisdiction of each agency and programs for reassessment and of the treatment and the rehabilitation. All right, finally, the bill will require that the Superior Court and these other entities, government entities, jointly make a report to the Speaker of the Guam Legislature regarding the implementation of this act that include the standardized procedures developed, the results of the programs created, including expected and actual effectiveness of assessment, treatment, and rehabilitation in reducing levels of dangerousness or risk of recidivism or offenders while incarcerated and on release. One of the issues that the bill talks about is developing a treatment plan, but we realize that the ability of our agencies to actually implement these is going to fluctuate, but we still want that information to be available to the persons who are responsible for allowing release. For example, if there is not treatment available, they should know that. And if there was never treatment available before their release, they should know that. So hoping we can finesse this with your testimony today. And so we did, well, I'll just begin now. And so we'll accept testimony from those who have signed up. We've got the director of the Department of the Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center, Ms. Therese Ariola, please come. Director Brennan, did you want to testify? Okay. Robert Camacho? Dr. Fergerger, did you want to testify? All right. Is there anyone else who would like to testify today? We've also received, for the record, prior to the hearing, testimony from Dr. Pat Timinglo, who's a professional at the Department of Corrections, and with very detailed information regarding the treatment, the assessment, types of assessment that are available and that she recommends, and She made a point to say that punishment is more likely to lead to a reduction in target behavior if identified punishment or sanction immediately follows the behavior. And she says, while the thought that punishment or sanctions may be effective, there are cases where punishment does not reduce a target behavior. And in that point, she's speaking towards we had put in a punitive penalty if they do not comply with the treatment that they're supposed to be undergoing. But she supports the special assessment and treatment for this type of offenders. All right, so Director Arriola, please.
Good afternoon, Senators. Please excuse me, my voice is it's not here today, but I will do my best. Before you have a copy of my testimony. I will read the beginning, and then there's some considerations for the legislature to look at, and perhaps if you will excuse me, I won't read that because it's rather lengthy. But for the record, my name is Therese Arriola, the Director of Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center. Buenas and Hafaday, Chairman Senator Therese Terlaje, and honorable members of the Health, Tourism, Historic Preservation, Land Justice Legislative Committee, Senators of the 35th Guam Legislature. Thank you for inviting me to testify on Bill 173-35 COR. After review of the bill and receiving input from Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center's clinical administrator, our psychiatrist, and our lead psychologist, Dr. Fergerger, who's with me today, we offer support in Bill 173's intent, which is to establish the standardization of risk assessment and system of evidence-based treatment programs for criminal sexual conduct offenders. Today, in speaking about victims of sexual acts, Guam Behavioral Health provides evidentiary services for sexual assault victims. Our Healing Hearts program then refers victims for counseling services. Guam Behavioral Health also provides counseling for sexual assault victims across their entire lifespan. With regards to sexual offenders, Guam Behavioral Health already provides psychiatric services for individuals currently at DOC who may or may not be convicted of sexual crimes. We currently provide counseling and psychological services for individuals who report that they served time in prison for sexual crimes, but was not the initial reason for them to seek Guam Behavioral Services. For example, just this week alone, an individual came seeking services at Guam Behavioral Health, and in the intake process revealed they served time for sexual crimes. So sometimes these revelations come after much questioning and further probing and intake questioning. Despite the support on the intent of Bill 173, please allow me to share comment suggestions that Guam Behavioral Health recommends. As Guam's only community mental health agency, Guam Behavioral Health does not have access to the forensic files nor direct contact with probation office of sexual offenders. Absent this very vital information, Guam Behavioral Health would not be the best lead providers. It is our opinion that the Department of Corrections' current psychiatric unit, who has access to court hearing records and criminal charges, would be the ideal lead providers to do readiness assessment and begin transitional treatment before release. Guam Behavioral Health then enters the picture once an offender is released from prison and continues to seek services in the community. And then there are several pages of thoughts and considerations of sex offender profiling, recommendation, what works, what doesn't work. And bottom line, Senators, we support the intent. I'm here, the department is here to work with the committee to move the intent of Bill 173 forward. And thank you very much for this testimony, and if you could excuse me.
Appreciate that very much, Director. Is there any question for the Director? Senator? All right, thank you. And I appreciate they are very detailed information that you have attached regarding the science of it.
Science, what works, what doesn't work.
Yes.
Of course, after this hearing, we're always a phone call away if you need any more information.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much, Director. Mr. Camacho?
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you very much for opening this discussion up for the public. Appreciate it. My name is Robert Camacho. I used to work at DOC. I'm recently retired, but I served many years at DOC, 22 years, as a parole officer and also as deputy and director. And just recently, the governor asked me to be part of the parole board. And so, my interest here is just on the basis of possibly being appointed as a member for the parole board and any future other things that involving the criminal justice system. And I guess when I was looking at this, and I fully support anything that has to do with assessments and, ensuring that the community is not at risk. And I just have a few points here, some things to consider and possibly add into the law or make some modifications possibly. I guess the whole thing is about risk, and the fact of the matter is any kind of testing is not going to be 100% accurate, right? We all understand that. And there's manipulation, there's, inmates can say whatever you want to say, they think that you want to hear. And so these are the hard parts of determining whether or not these are truthful evaluations, and can these evaluations really go to the core of the problem. And some of the things, I guess, is how effective have the current programs at DOC have been. And we won't know that until we could probably find out what the recidivism rate of all those who have been convicted of criminal have been returned, either because of not only of sexual conduct but other issues. I've talked to many psychologists throughout the years and psychiatrists that have been at DOC, and of course there used to be this. I don't hear it very often, but they used to say that criminal sexual conduct is not just a sex crime; it's a crime of violence. And so one of the things I want to point out is that not just criminal sexual conduct treatment, but also anger management, personal relations, and family, development, because all of these have, some kind of connection, and maybe there's other issues that we are not aware of. But I think you have to look at all the gamut, not just in psychologists, of course, the caseworkers and whoever has involved with the treatment program with the inmates, the security reports, of course. There are incidences where inmates are assaulted in the prison. Has this individual been accused of sexually assaulting another inmate? And there's even what they call the Prison Rape Elimination Act. That's how critical this issue is that even in prison, inmates are sexually assaulted. I'm not sure about DOC right now or what, but this is the history of prisons. So another thing I think is very important, I know when you serve 2/3 or a certain portion of your time, you're allowed to go up for the parole board. And I agree, if the individual doesn't attend any type of treatment, I don't think he should be qualified. And maybe the thought might be, why do we force a person to go through this program if he's not willing? Well, if he's not willing, that means he's not ready. And it's extremely critical that the individual takes responsibility of his actions, and if he was found guilty. And you'll find that some individuals who have been convicted are not ready to accept that they committed this crime. They'll continue to blame the victim, or they falsely accused, or what. And maybe there might be some incidents, few and far between, I would think. But we have to consider these situations. The other part is that when the individual doesn't get paroled, or let's say he is denied, he has to be released, full-time release. And the law requires that they have to serve 3 years of parole, mandatory. So even if he doesn't go on parole, he still has to be on parole after his term. So I think that's another thing that we have to consider putting into the law, is that even his full-time release, he still has to maintain, and if he doesn't, then something should be done. I'm not sure what the sanction will be, or should he be returned back for the sake of the community because he refuses? And then, of course, you have indigent parolees who can't find a job, they can't, get any work, and so they can't probably get the treatment or pay for a private counselor or what have you. And so that may be where mental health has, some kind of group therapy that they have for those who are suffering. I'm not sure what kind of programs are available there, but those are things that we have to possibly consider, because there are going to be many inmates out there who get released on full-time release and are not going to have a job, or are not going to be able to pay for services if we say that, okay, you're going to go through continued treatment. The other part, I would think, is that on parole, many years ago, there were different statuses of parole supervision. They had maximum, minimum, and medium. And maximum is you have to report 5 times a month. Okay, medium maybe 3, and then the minimum is once a month. So maybe for a certain time period after the release, they should be in maximum supervision. And, and that's where also there is supposed to be parole officer contact, like 5+1, meaning 5 times he has to meet with the parolee and ensure that he's at home. And I guess that will correspond with Senator Moylan's law proposal bill with electronic monitoring. That was help extremely, for sure. So those are things to consider, and I think, but I guess we have to ask ourselves this: if a parolee comes in, and let's say this is his second time that he has been paroled, or he was previously convicted, he got paroled, he served his time, comes back in for another one, maybe a lesser crime of CSC 4 or whatever, or 3. Do we give him parole or not? Or is you got one chance and that was it, no more? That's something that we have to consider. And, if we want to have a much stronger, stance on an individual's behavior out there. And, I talked to one psychologist many years ago, and especially when it comes to sexual assaults on minors, it is one of the most difficult things to change. And these perpetrators have a hard time with it. So, again, we need to look at that and don't take any risk, because I would almost assume from past experience and what I've read before that most of these people that have assaulted a child will return in some form or another. And maybe they might not get in as criminal sexual, but maybe assault or simple assault, or depending on what the plea bargain might be. The other thing is that, because we have so many inmates out there, and I'm not sure how many are with criminal sexual conduct, I'm not sure if they have the resources to do individual, but definitely there should be group therapy if you can't handle everything. And I think, looking at this, and I know possibly going to the parole board and reviewing these pre-parole studies, I will be concerned, and I will possibly, I would not support any parole that if there's no evaluation. And we need to look at the contracts of these psychologists and psychiatrists. Does it include individual counseling? Does it include group therapy? Because if it doesn't, it needs to be changed, because that might be another bone of contention if it's not included in their contract. So that's my whole take on this. I've done hundreds of pre-parole studies and criminal sexual conduct, and it is a very challenging thing to determine whether or not this individual is doing this or is hiding under some situation where he's actually assaulting somebody. We find out later, or sometimes it might be too late. So I'm very concerned about who we let out in the community. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Camacho. Ms. Ariel?
Thank you, Senator. There was one major thing that I needed to add to my testimony earlier, and I would be remiss because I know that resources will never, we're not rolling in a lot of money. And already my sister agency, Department of Correction, we're all trying to live within our means and being smarter about how we spend. So when I recommended that the psychiatric unit at the Department of Correction take the lead on this because they have access to information that's very important. That goes without saying that they would need to have the support financially and revamping and probably more psychologists and revamping, maybe not revamping, but increasing the resources that are available in their psychiatric unit. So I just need to make that statement on the record that the recommendation has to come with more resources and more support for their unit.
Thank you very much, Director Brennan. And Mr. Camacho, is there any question for Mr. Camacho? Senator Taitugui?
First, I'd like to thank everyone who's here today, but especially you, Bob, for being here. You have a wealth of knowledge. Of course, we all know, working at DOC for many years, as well as being, a peace officer. And I'm glad to hear that the parole board, you're looking at serving on the parole board, which almost right now it sounded like you were auditioning for a parole board right now. But it's great, at least we got this information, so please bring it again when you go for your confirmation hearing. And the reason why I wanted to ask you is, when you were a DOC director, did you come across any type of assessments like this that were used in other jurisdictions that you wanted to?
We had multiple types of assessments. We had Dr. Kalingo there, who had multiple types of group therapy. And of course, he's a well-known psychiatrist here. And so we were doing multiple types of assessment. I can't tell you what exactly the term of the studies were, but we did have those things available. And he did conduct group therapy for different types of, from personal enrichment to personal responsibility, and not just on CSC, but also on drug treatment, and just working on the individual self. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in many years, not just on psychologists, but they had a lot of these church activities that we had, where people from the Catholic, the Jehovah Witness, the Baptist, and they were just ministering to these inmates, and they were helping them cope with some of those things, those anger issues, those issues with, and I think that was a extremely helpful thing as part of a comprehensive, treatment program, not just psychology or academic. And one of the things that I did have implemented at the time was that when Dr. Kalingo made these programs, and I was wondering how effective was it? How do we know that they were listening, or were they just sitting there and pretending to listen and not really, just to put on a check mark on their parole certificate, right? That I got this, I went to 60 hours of or 6 months, but was there participation? So it's not just coming there and just being present. I wanted to find out what did you have any kind of testing? And, you know, like let's say the concepts, you know, what triggered these sexual, you know, impulses? And did we have those type of identify how to recognize it, how to avoid it? Because I saw a lot of people graduating from these programs, but my concern was, were they really learning? And were they just there to, you know, fill in a chair and, you know, make a check mark on the parole application? So there has to be something where, if we're going to have some kind of group therapy or group whatever, is there and I don't want to make it sound, because, you know, I had this discussion with Dr. Kalingo he says, this is not an academic thing, this is a therapeutic thing. But you got to have a balance. How do we know that these individuals are listening and are grasping the concepts so that they can apply it when they get out? You know, attendance is not treatment. This is my whole concern. So I think that, yeah, there are, things that they can fill out and do an assessment. And I believe there are even some computer programs that will help them go through that whole assessment program.
And thank you so much. And I really appreciate that last comment that you made, that attendance is not treatment.
Right.
You know, that's very well said and very well put. Thank you so much.
And that's where, you know, it can be a difficult thing when you're in the parole board and he says, oh, he's been for the past year, he's gone. But if you ask the psychologist, what does he do? He's reading the newspaper or magazine, or, you know, he's out looking out, and, you know, these are things that it has to be comprehensive with the caseworker and the parole officer interviewing, whatever, and maybe the caseworker has an assessment there that says he's, you know, maybe he's going through programs, like let's say he's in there for, you know, assaulting a police officer, and he went to anger management, but he shows signs of not, you know, treating other inmates fairly or whatever.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments.
Okay.
You know, and comprehension is most key to it.
Right.
As well. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Director Brennan?
Thank you. Samantha Brennan for the Department of Corrections. I just wanted to bring up, I know Director Ariola spoke about being the Department of Corrections taking the lead. However, in our just short discussion right now, I also made it clear, she discusses that we have access to the court hearing records, and that's not necessarily the case. We may get a copy, I believe, of the charging document, but not necessarily have access to all court records. That would be somebody at the court would probably have most of the access to a file. So I just wanted to be on the record. We may get the charges and what their criminal charges for that. And of course, if they had been a DNC previously, then we will have a history of when they were there and what their charges were. But we don't necessarily have full access to any court hearing records. I just wanted to put that on the record. And just wondering where the court is as well.
That's a very good question. We were not formally informed that they wouldn't be here, and I was hoping they would be here, but I was informally informed that they are working on their testimony. But I do agree, their involvement and lead on this is really crucial, because it's at that point of contact where the assessment is very valuable, and I think it's that's where the primary decisions are being made as to release, and except for the parole board, of course, and then the Department of Corrections comes in. But yes, it's very important, and we know that. So my intention is that they're doing assessments and they're assessing different things, and primarily it sounded like they are assessing risk of appearing for your court date. You know, they want to ensure that this person is going to show up for the next court date, and which is very valid, but not at all assessing whether this person is going to be reoffending while they are out there. And that is, I think, what the community is most concerned about at this point. So I very much thank you for being here. Two directors, Mr. Camacho, and the staff from the Department of Corrections, thank you, and from the Guam Behavioral Health. Are there any other questions? Thank you, Ian. And again, thank you for the details in the testimony where you recommend certain programs, certain types of testing, and the science behind it. I appreciate that very much. Si Diyos masi. The second agenda item is Bill number 99-35. I would like to ask the sponsor of the bill to introduce the bill. Senator Moylan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Bill 9935 is an act to amend a couple of subsections of Chapter 89, subsections 89.13 alpha and subsection 89.13 bravo. That's for Title 9 of Guam Code Annotated relative to electronic monitoring of sex offenders on probation and parole. So this kind of coincides with our last public hearing on 17135. So this bill is strengthening the use of electronic monitoring devices, or ankle bracelets as they're also known, for certain defendants that are convicted of certain crimes who are either on house arrest, probation, or parole. And public safety officers, giving them and the ability to monitor their whereabouts. What this hopefully does is means to deter potential repeat offenders. And with Guam's law currently, it makes these monitoring devices an option, and it's not a mandate requirement for those on probation or parole, specifically just for sex offenders. As we know, probationers and parolees, they're just on temporary freedom. And as earlier mentioned, that's just requires close monitoring. So the objective of this amendment to the current law is to mandate for those who are registered as sexual offenders serving probation or parole that they shall wear an electronic monitoring device. And it places the responsibility on the individual to purchase or lease the device itself. So basically, the bill is changing on that subsection of the current law for the Superior Court, instead of saying may, to shall. And also it removes that the monitoring device, provided that the court may order the cost of the portion paid by the court. As well as for the Territorial Parole Board, instead of shall require the parolee to use the device, it shall require the parolee to use the device. So that's, as an introduction to the bill, it's basically to strengthen the existing law, as what we've been learning from what's happening in our criminal activity and the repeat offenders with CSC offenses, and to assist probation officers and parole officers to monitor these folks that are on temporary freedom or temporary release from the requirements that is required to them from the Department of Corrections or by the Department of the Judiciary as well. So thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Moylan. We have signed up to testify on Bill number 99-35, Mr. Camacho, Robert Camacho, and Mark Perez. Is there anyone else who would like to testify on this bill? Now, I know that the judiciary had begun a pilot program for this electronic monitoring, and I was hoping today to get a report from them as to the status of that program. I know that we had passed a law in the last term to allow that electronic monitoring could be used for domestic violence cases, and that it was already allowed to be used for sexual misconduct cases, and that this bill would require it to be used for release in those cases. But At one point, I think it was in the budget hearings, the judiciary had come in and reported that they were working on their rules as to this electronic monitoring, trying to implement it, and that they were looking at using it for their low-risk offenders. That might not be the exact words that they used, but it seemed to be the lower-risk offenders that they were thinking to use this for. And so I really was hoping they would be here today to clarify whether the program has begun, what types of cases they are currently planning to use it for, and if this would be consistent or not. But, all right, so we'll proceed. Mr. Camacho.
Yes, good afternoon. And again, thank you very much, Senators, for the opportunity to speak. And of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that my whole interest is on the parole board and what it might affect. And I totally support this. And of course, what the question would be, again, is how do we get this individual to pay for it, being that he has to, be on this, and it's probably going to be a monthly payment for sure, right? So here are my thoughts. My thoughts are, we have a prison industry program, or at least by law. I'm not sure if it's a viable program at this point, but they have the prison industry program. Possibly in that area, that could also help to fund, if it, as an option or as an alternative for those, at least temporarily, and give the inmate or the parolee 6 months, and if he doesn't find a job in 6 months, you can cover the first with the prison industry program, if that's possible. I'm not sure. The other part, every parolee that gets released should have a residence, a parole advisor, and an employment. That's typically what happens when they get released. Sometimes they don't have a job, but they usually have a parole advisor and a place to stay, right? So with the combination of the parole advisor and maybe the family, they could afford the $35 a month. And here's the thing, it's all about how you might look at it. And when they come up for the parole board, they can ask the family, are you willing to pay for this? And that will be part of the consideration, of course. And if they say yes, how about the parole advisor? Are you willing to, pay $15 and the other side, whatever the cost might be a month. So if they can distribute that and say yes, then that's, where the hurdle might be or overcome, is by getting the families involved. The other part is, again, here's where we have the religious organizations that have been coming to the DOC and helping out. Many of them want the parolee to come and help out in the community, be in their church, and all that. And I'm almost sure that many of them wouldn't mind picking up a collection to help these people out. So if we're going to look at these options, and that's where it also helps the inmate to be involved with the programs, right? So if the money is the big issue, there are some possible, and that's what I'm thinking about, And of course, with today's technology nowadays, there's many, internet things where they can put up a camera in the home, maybe one in the bedroom or whatever, and of course, when the individual can be turned on or monitored that the individual is at home sleeping or what have you. You can set up the standards for that. I mean, we do it all the time with CCTV, but if you like a cost reduction, that might be something that, working with some security companies, they can provide that as an alternative to monthly. I don't know. It just depends, because if your intention is to monitor them at every step of the way, then that's not probably going to work, right? But as far as home arrest or home, are they home at 9 o'clock at night? I'm not sure, but that's my whole thought behind that, and I wanted to make sure that, because money will be the issue, and you might say, well, we're not going to get people to get paroled at all, and the population is going to be increased because we can't get them paroled because they don't have the money for electronic monitoring. Whatever you choose, there's always going to be a challenge somewhere. But that's my thoughts on how to overcome some of the financial issues. Okay. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Camacho. Mr. Cruz? Paris? Mr. Paris?
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Camacho. Money is going to be an issue. He does give viable solutions to the money issue, because not every inmate is going to be able to afford the electronic monitoring. But do you know how much it costs to do electronic monitoring? Because the bill didn't say how much.
Sorry, could you state your name for the record so it's on the recording?
My name's Mark Perez. I'm a social worker at DOC.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Right.
Paris. Did you want to answer that? Or?
From what I'm hearing, $20 monthly.
Okay, well, that seems viable, right? But there will be some that basically don't want to pay. And what do we do with them? Do we just stockhouse them in DOC for the duration of their parole supervision, which is for 3 years? And if that's so, we keep them for 3 years. They just get released after the 3 years without supervision, or do we keep them longer? So as an alternative for those that just refuses to pay or can't pay, what is another option? I mean, I support this. I mean, $20, $30 a month, you know, I think it's very affordable. But if a client just can't pay, because it is difficult. I did talk with parole earlier to find out some of their clients, those who are CSE offenders, what is their status, you know? One parole officer was saying one has a job, 2 are still looking for a job, and a third one is getting interviewed. And so what are the options are, and does DOC hold them forever? That's my concern. That's it.
We were hoping we would get a fee schedule from the courts if they are still implementing this electronic monitoring program. So we'll see. If we get that information, we'll forward it to the Department of Corrections also for your information. And any other questions? Senator Shelton?
Thank you very much. Thank you both for being here. I guess my questions would also go to the court. If I guess I could just put it on the record and hope that they'll respond in their testimony. I'm curious as to how individuals who are being released are chosen for the electronic monitoring already, and if in their sentencing this is considered additional punishment, and if that needs to be taken into consideration, and if it's if it's based on the level of offender who's being given this electronic monitoring. Then I'd also like to hear from the court what if they have the capacity to continue monitoring all of these individuals. I understand that those who have the electronic monitoring devices will be the ones to pay for the device, but will there be additional manpower needed to monitor them? That's about it.
My understanding is that they were looking at contracting with a company who would operate them, the equipment and do the monitoring, but of course that's subject to verification. So thank you for the questions. Any other questions? All right, I want to thank you again for your testimony today and your suggestions for improvement. Si Diyos masi. We're going to move now to the third agenda item, Bill number 148-35 LS. And I'd like to thank you for your patience, those who have signed up to testify. And if you could go ahead and have a seat while the author is introducing the bill. This is authored by Senator James Moylan. Senator Moylan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Bill 14835 is an amending a current law. It's subsection 8110 of Chapter 81, Title 9, Guam Code annotated, and it's relative to the work credit for those incarcerated at Department of Corrections. So the work credit program, it's been in existence since 1980. And it was slightly modified over the years, including in the year 2000, when the program was designed to basically help qualified inmates with the intent of shortening their sentencing by 1 day for each 40 hours worked. When this bill was introduced back in May, we worked with some correctional folks and learned that currently, at that time, there was about 10 individuals out of the several hundred who were the only ones qualified for this program. So with such a large number of inmates residing at Department of Corrections, we wanted to look at how we can increase those that could qualify for the program in order to help reduce their sentencing time at Department of Corrections. There probably are several inmates who truly want to give back to the community through labor-intensive beautification projects, and this would also help them acclimate back into the community, because we know that majority of the inmates will be given their freedom back upon release. So this is helpful for them to get back to the community, and also by providing a service and acclimate them back into the community as well. Now, not all inmates are eligible for this program for such felonies such as a first and second degree criminal sexual contact, that they remain locked up. But how we're looking at modernizing the existing law is allowing those who qualify for what's called pre-parole classification, and for those convicted of lesser severe crimes. Now, the pre-parole classification are inmates who have served no less than 2/3 of their sentence, and most likely are looking at going in front of the parole board for their release. How this bill targets the existing law is adding into the section 8110 under work credits the word pre-parole or minimum out classification, and adding to what areas or possibility of how they can assist in cleaning up the area, our island. Maintenance works with the public parks and beaches and villages and school sports facilities, beautification projects including coordinating with the Guam Visitors Bureau, an island-wide beautification task force, even Guam Liberation Day activities. Currently, the law also says that the inmate must be physically able to do such work. What this bill does is add not only physically able, but also psychologically able to do the work as well. I think this bill will also assist the Department of Corrections by having control over it. The existing law says that the director of Department of Public Works and Parks and Recreations shall cooperate with DOC director, but now we're allowing DOC director shall be the actual contact person for any government entity, committee, or task force seeking prisoners for the beautification and maintenance projects. Instead of having these outside folks kind of dictate to DOC, it's going to be up to DOC, not somebody telling them. It also establishes a memorandum of understanding between the Department of Corrections and any other government agency that is looking for the inmate's assistance on projects. And it assigns these agencies that are asking for assistance on projects to come up with the supplies that are needed to do these projects, so not to overburden the Department of Corrections. If you need a bush cutter, if you need rakes, if whatever items that you need to beautify the areas of Guam, then those agencies requesting inmates' help would have to provide those equipments for the inmates. So I realize that this may not be an urgent subject for Department of Corrections with all the issues going on right now, but I think it's just helpful that we at least look at this for the future as things improve with the Department of Corrections. So I appreciate any comments on the bill. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Rupley?
Hi, Hafide. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nick Rupley Lee. I'm the Public Information Officer for the Guam Environmental Protection Agency. Walter Leon Guerrero, our administrator, sends his regrets for not being able to attend, and he sends me in his place to offer his testimony. The Guam EPA stands in support of Bill 148-35 LS. We are pleased with the author's measure, as the work credit program described in the bill has the potential for a wide array of applications in most labor-intensive beautification projects and could benefit our island if implemented properly. A litany of environmental concerns like illegal dumping, deforestation, and general maintenance of targeted underkept areas like parks, beaches, community facilities will have the additional support to be addressed with the work program. As the author pointed out, agencies like Guam EPA or Parks and Recs, GVB, the Mayor's Council, and the IBTF are some of the entities that could consider availing of these sources provided by the work credit program. Media reports over the last few years indicate that the cost of inmate care to be estimated at over $100 a day, and so qualified offenders who participate in community projects can be considered an untapped resource where taxpayers could see a return in the form of service towards their taxpayer dollars that go to caring for the inmates. The agency also appreciates the value of the program, as it provides the qualified offender performing community work a chance at reduced recidivism. But the agency is not, we're not experts in correctional facilities management, nor are we experts in inmate management. So that we ask that you consider some of the fears that might be concerning to the public, including things like escaping or erroneous qualification for the work credit program, or damage to person or property, whether intentional or unintentional, in community projects. There are 8 programs that comprise the agency, and each of these programs routinely receive tips or complaints or inquiries from the public about some type of environmental harm that's being caused, in somebody's house or a business or on a piece of government property. One of the things that the program shares with the administrator is it's a common theme that gets mentioned very routinely about suggesting that inmates be used or be considered for use for cleanup, particularly with dump sites and beaches. So if passed into law, it looks like our constituent concerns could have a fighting chance to be addressed. Participation from the qualified offender and the government agencies that need the manpower is crucial. We understand that we can't force people to participate, but we're glad to see an update that would provide a clearer means for all interested parties to do so. We can agree with the need for the MOU to be executed to participate, but our administrator wants clarification on the frequency at which the MOU must be executed. Is it per project, per year, per sentencing? So those are some of the things that I would like to take back and share with our administrator. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. If you have any questions, I'm available. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Any questions for Mr. Lee? All right, Mr. Paris.
Thank you. My name is Mark Perez, again, social worker with DOC. I am in support of the bill, this bill. I think it's good that we are expanding it beyond DPW and Parks and Rec. I just asked for further clarification, possibly to remove the term pre-parole. You do mention it in the bill as someone who has served 2/3, but there's other parole terms like the 50% for the first offenders. And if that's left in the law, it becomes a right for the inmate to argue that I am eligible for parole, but they don't want to go up for parole. And so they can essentially be in this program for 5, 10 years until their full-time release date, depending on the charges and so forth. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Paris. I'd also like to note that on the fiscal note for this bill, BBMR attached some feedback that they had received from the Department of Corrections, which I believe is very helpful. It points out terms that should be changed and updated,
Right.
different things, so maybe you had input to that.
And also, one add-on, it talks about Chapter 25, which is the criminal sexual conduct chapter in the 9 GCA. I would also just add on, if you are a registered sex offender, you are not qualified for the program at all. Because this talks about only the second-degree felony and higher, but the fourth-degree CSC is a misdemeanor. But I believe it's in Guam law that if you're on the sex offender registry, you cannot work for Gov Guam, and so that just removes them from working at the schools or from doing labor on public grounds.
Are they ineligible for the work credit program?
They would be ineligible.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Paris. Any other questions for Mr. Paris? Senator Shelton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony again, Mr. Paris. I'm wondering if you can share with us kind of the process of how the program works already. Is it DOC that provides the transportation for the inmates to the work site?
Yes. Once the clients are promoted to minimum amount, depending upon their conviction, that will identify the community program. If they meet this criteria, second degree homicide, CSC, robbery, escape, then they're not in the work credit program. But if they serve that portion in their sentence, then they become eligible for the work credit program. However, now going back, once they're made eligible and are classified minimum amount, then they start rolling out with the post-9 community corrections officers. The officers, sometimes one officer, sometimes 2 or 3, depending on the manpower available, rolls out on a predetermined schedule. And they basically go out for anywhere from 5 to 8 hours, sometimes longer, depending on the need. However, we start running into problems with those who are eligible for the work credit program and the education release program. They need to be brought back early so they can go to school. And so just more logistics needs to be done.
Okay. Do you think that there's a struggle between sharing the manpower for this program with the transportation and the supervision with, the needs at the prison itself?
I cannot answer that. I'm not part of security, and so I just address the program itself.
Director Brennan.
If I may, so currently we have, I believe it's eight eligible inmates at Post 9 who are able to go out for work credit. So when they go out on a daily basis, actually from Tuesday to Saturday, depending on what venue has been requested, what area is requesting, then we will send them out to do it. That usually requires 2 to 3 officers because of the ratio. Once they go out into that area, as Mark said, they maybe leave at 8:30 in the morning, and then the education is, mid-afternoon. They got to come back and take them back. So that requires manpower to all the way around. So that becomes, again, another issue where it is shortage of we have a shortage of manpower now. So that will definitely add to another a bigger problem if we're going to go back and forth. So we try and limit it to the 8 that we have now, and maybe the education credits are not part of it. So overall, depending on who's requested, and if we have the proper officers to go out and do it, then we will do it as best that we can.
Okay, thank you very much. So are there times you would say that you have to maybe put the program on hold when you are really struggling for the manpower?
We actually just started back the program
Okay.
because of situations that have transpired within DOC over the last couple of weeks. So just this week we went back, and we had to go to the different agencies that we currently work with, and then we had to schedule them accordingly. We get requests from the mayor's office, we get requests from DPW, we get requests from GPD, we get requests from DPR. So we get all these requests, and we have to fit everybody accordingly. So we have to make our own schedule with the inmates that we have, as well as the manpower that we have, and we do our very best to try and meet everybody's needs. However, there are times where a mayor's office may request for 3 to 4 days, and we can only give them 2 because we're trying to stretch it out for everybody to be fair. So it always varies, but again, our manpower shortage and stuff, yes, it could happen where we could stop it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think it's good for us to understand that if we're going to expand the program, will it also, kind of contribute to spreading you a little thinner than you anticipated being. So I appreciate that information.
Yes, and at all times when our inmates are out, in that respect, they have to be supervised by officers.
Thank you.
Could I make one more comment on this bill? Also, if the intent is to expand the program with more inmate participation, we will always be limited to about 10 inmates, because the Community Correction Center currently houses about 20 some inmates, and that is work release eligible, work credit eligible, education release. If we actually had a larger facility, we can accommodate more. With larger facility, more manpower, we could do more projects out there. Beautification, going out, fighting the rhino beetle if we need to, but it's just needing the facility and the manpower. And also the question asked about how does it work. We also work with the other agencies to provide equipment and supplies.
Senator Taitigui?
Just to follow up, maybe I missed it earlier. Per inmate, how many guards do you need? If you have 3 inmates or 5 inmates per 1 guard, how do you determine how many guards?
Currently, in this program, it's 5 inmates to 1 officer.
Okay.
And stuff. So if there's 10 going out, I usually try and send at least 3 officers.
The driver is considered one, or?
Yes, they're all 3 officers that are going to be there to manage the inmates that are with them.
Okay, so to 5 inmates, it's 1 officer, not including the driver of the vehicle?
It's everybody, ma'am. So if there's only 10 inmates, sometimes 3 officers will go out just for safety and security reasons.
Oh, okay, but it's 5 inmates to 1 officer?
5 to 1, yes.
Okay.
That's kind of what the ratio that we currently are using.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I did want to bring up, based on what Mr. Perez said, he's talked about our halfway house. We only house 20, maybe 22. That's really packing it in with the as big as the house is. And so if the intent of this bill is to allow other inmates that are housed within the facility, outside of the halfway house, then that might be an issue, and we may not. Then, personally, I would not support that, because that may lead to other problems for us. And I say that with when they get into the halfway house, of course, they have these privileges and stuff based on the law, and if we allow other inmates to from within the units, the other units and stuff, then that just might be an issue for us where it's going to be some contraband coming back in, and then the mindsets may be different because at the halfway house, that's where we're preparing them for their release. So just for the record, I just want it to be that if we're going to expand it to, you want to do 10 or more as Mark has said, and we want to do 30 more and stuff like this, then we need a bigger facility in order to do that. That's what I would ask for, and then I would support that.
The halfway house, when I'm driving into the Department of Corrections, it's the first house on the right-hand side.
Yes,
Right?
yes, sir.
So originally, that was somebody's home, right? That original building, I mean, maybe Officer Bob Camacho could answer that. But I remember when I was back at Corrections, even our own parole office used to be somebody's house. None of those buildings were really made for multi-dwelling inmates housing things, right? We just kind of, the government of Guam bought that property, which used to be somebody's house, and then kind of put in a whole bunch of bunk beds and made it into a correctional halfway house for inmates. So yeah, I do. You're absolutely right. I mean, the facility itself was not made for a halfway house for the Department of Corrections. It's more like a temporary housing for somebody that's homeless as they move on to someplace else. But I appreciate that. Thank you, Director.
Thank you very much. Maybe this is the best time. I just want to note for the record some of the feedback on the fiscal note from, it looks like it came from DOC. And so they mentioned that pre-parole is not a classification, but more of a status indicating inmates' eligibility for parole. The bill should reflect those classified minimum out, community corrections, pre-release, or parolee status. It says DOC caseworkers and parole division noted there's no need to modify work credit participation requirements to increase the participation pool. The participation is low because of a lack of clients classified minimum out and lack of officers to supervise. Further, small numbers due to housing unit not being able to accommodate larger number of inmates. Note, DOC recommends amendment to change psychologically fit to socially fit, and this can be determined via observations by trained individuals observing how they participate in compound work programs and treatment programs. DOC also further stated there may be a cost impact relative to ensuring inmates are psychologically fit in terms of conducting psych evals. And then they noted also something about the cost of the equipment, but I noted that the bill made it very clear that the cost would be borne by the agency that's requesting the service, so hopefully that would also help. All right, so Mr. Camacho.
Yeah, yes, good afternoon again, ma'am. I just want to kind of give some thoughts about what Senator Moylan was mentioning. The current director's office and the current housing for the CCC, for the halfway house, those were minimum out housings for inmates. So of course, when the changes in administration, things move around, and of course, the lack of space had an effect. I wanted to just kind of, because when an individual comes up for parole, we're always hoping when you're in the parole board that they are prepared psychologically and emotionally and all that. And there used to be a term called trustee many years ago. This is like back in the early 80s or 70s. And that's critical to understand where we are supposed to be at once they come to minimum. And they used to have minimum and minimum out. There was two different levels of classification. I'm not sure what it is now. So if we're talking about, manpower and who can supervise, how many people can supervise, maybe we can just change the classification so that, let's say if the individual is, let's say for parole, typically the parole, the inmate is heard a couple of months beforehand. Let's say he's coming up for parole and he has 2 months free time as far as before he gets paroled. He could be classified as minimum out. So maybe he doesn't need that direct supervision. Maybe we can put him at the mayor's office. And, I mean, look at it this way. Look at the common sense behind this, is that sometimes we have, I'm not sure if this is ongoing, but we have inmates that go to school. Some of them have degrees. They have AA and B, bachelor's degree. They got a grant or what have you. And so there's one officer, and there might be five inmates out there in different classrooms, and he doesn't have a direct sight. He just has to be in the area, but he doesn't sit in the classroom, So using that mindset, maybe we can look at what is the requirement. Maybe it can be 1 in 10, because they're already at this level. They're at trustee level, So, and sometimes the officers that I'm not sure what they do now, but they didn't have like shotguns and stuff like that. This is a certain level. So that would be up to the director, of course, and you as the legislature, what would be an acceptable risk regarding that. But some thoughts, maybe we can also include parolees into this, where it's in law where when they complete 40 hours, they get 1 day off. Because that's a whole pool. There's possibly 200, 300 parolees. I'm not sure what it is. Probationers, I believe, when I remember, it was over 1,000 probationers. I mean, this could be another avenue of, that would help with alternative sentencing, if you can put that in. I'm not sure if this is the right time or what have you, but something to put in the back of your head, as far as maybe they can have if they put in 200 hours of community service as an alternative sentencing, that can help with their, being on their sentencing and have a less longer sentence or what have you. The other part is that, parolees used to be put in the mayor's office without any kind of supervision. If they're not working, they go to the mayor's office and they help out. We used to have an agreement with Guam Housing and Restaurant Association that they provided the van, the whips, and the gasoline, and the bush cutters and mowers, and we just supply the inmate and the food, and so there's that private and public partnership. We did the same thing with GVP to clean the bathrooms and so forth, and of course DPR really needs help, right? And they just can't keep up with all the trash and all what have you. So we were doing those things many years ago, and these inmates were getting credit for this. I mean, people don't even realize that down at Ipao Beach, you see a lot of these concrete benches. Those concrete benches over there were made by the inmates. All around the governor's office, that whole wall was created by inmates, those rock walls, back in the 80s. That was all done by inmate labor. So there is opportunities here, and it's really good for the inmates to get out there and, constructive activities. I mean, graffiti, they can do these different things. They can clean up graffiti all throughout the whole village. We mentioned about liberation, before, and I remember Senator Tello worked with me on liberation. I was the chairman for 2 years, and we used the inmates, and they got work credit for helping to build the Queen's Float. And the Liberation Committee, we provided the inmates with saws. We purchased it, and that became part of the work, the VRS, the vocational rehab. And that was the gift we gave to the inmates, the different saws and tools. And so and they get work credit for this. So there's a lot of opportunities here, and I'm glad you mentioned the liberation. The other part, you know, we can do it with GHRA again or wherever. There's a lot of private companies that need help, you know, and are willing to do this. Schools, and of course I hope that it was always during the summertime or after school, not during the school hours, that we have these work credits. But I'll tell you what, before we used to have a lot of inmates working the schools, cleaning up before school was started. We painted and all that, and these inmates got work credit. We were the ones that were the majority of the work, to do the painting, cleaning the sidewalks, bush cutting the whole schools, and doing a lot of renovations, you know. So this is a great program, and I think it's viable. Just a little bit of tweaking here and there, and I think it'll work out. But I think, you know, we got to look at that criteria at different levels of minimum. So if the individual is going to be released in 2 months or 6 months, there should be some kind of like consideration on that, and say, what is the transition? What is the reintegration, you know, apparatus for them to get out there? And, you know, the mayors love parolees because they help out tremendously. And if we can allow the parolees 1 day off for 40 hours of work, you know, while they do community service on the weekends or what have you, that would be great for them. So that's about it. I just wanted to kind of give an update on that, but I think it can all work. We just have to. And one last thing, you know, I work with the veterans, and if we can include the veteran cemetery in one of those places that the inmates can work, because they do need the help. Funding, of course, is always a problem. So if you can include the veteran cemetery as part of an area that they can work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Camacho. Are there any questions for the panel? If not, then I'd ask Senator Moyden to close on the bill, if you'd like to. All right, then. There being no additional individuals to present testimony, the public hearing is now adjourned. It's 3:30 p.m. Si Diyos masi todos.